Welcome to Lit with Lloyd. I am your host, Lloyd Russell. I want to do a shout out to KCAT for hosting our show. And today, I'm going to have to read it because our guest, Karen Joy Fowler, has so many credits to her name that I'm not going to be able to memorize them. So I'm going to read it. Author of 8 novels, 5 short stories and novellas, 3 collections, and 1 nonfiction. She was a finalist for the Man Booker Award, which is given to the best book published in the UK. And she won the Faulkner Award in 2013 for her 7th novel, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. It is the, quote, largest peer-juried award in the country, unquote. I'm honored to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. I listen sometimes to my introductions and I think, man, wouldn't it be great to be her? What a life she must lead.
Well, we're going to examine a little bit of that. And I want to start by telling you that we have a live audience. Audience, can we hear from you? And at the end of our interview, we're going to open it up if they have any questions for you.
All right. My husband is in that audience, so the questions may be, have you given any thought to dinner?
We will maybe designate that the questions need to be related to the interview. Okay. 2 personal notes for you. First note is, and I don't know if you remember this, back in 2014, I was working at Village House of Books, and you and Ramey Waters came for Authors Night.
I do remember that, yes.
And that was basically shortly after, I think it was the year after your We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves came out.
Yes.
And we read that for the event. The second thing is, based on your bio, you and I went to Cal Berkeley at the same time.
Really?
Yes.
And yet we never met.
That we know
of.
Well, I saw that you were a poli-sci major.
Yes.
And I was a history major. However, I did take a poli-sci class from Ralph Nader's sister. I'm wondering if we might have been in that same class together.
I have no recollection of Ralph Nader's sister teaching at Berkeley, so I am guessing not. I specialized mostly in South Asian politics.
Oh, wow.
So unless she was talking about India and Pakistan, probably I did not cross paths with her.
I seem to recall, although it's been a while, that it related to the Middle East, but I don't remember much about it other than that. So I guess I listened at least a little bit. Okay, but enough about me. Your first published work was in 1986, and it was a collection. Can you explain what a collection is, please?
It was just a collection of short stories, most of which had already been published. I think there were maybe a couple that were new to the collection. But it came about in a peculiar way. I had just started publishing short stories. I'd been writing for quite some time without any success. But I had just begun to publish, and one of the women, and I was publishing mostly in science fiction magazines at that time, and one of the women who was an editor at one of those science fiction magazines called me one day on the phone, and she said that she was moving from the magazine to Bantam Press, and that she was going to be publishing novels now, and she just wondered if I was one of those writers who had a novel in the drawer that I would like her to look at. And I did not. I had just barely begun to feel that I knew anything about writing the short stories. So I said, no, I don't. And she said, well, would you write me one? And I said, no, I won't. I'm just getting my feet wet with the short stories. And I think, in retrospect, I knew so little about publishing that the idea that it was unusual for an editor to call you up and ask for a novel was not in my head. But I think my refusal to do so interested her in a way that actually having a novel would not have. And so she became determined that I would write a novel for her. And in order to make that happen, she said, "What if I bring out a collection of your short stories? Will you then sign a contract that says you will also give me a novel?"
Well, that's amazing.
So I said yes. Maybe the amazing part is how the story ends, which is that I feel that we both lived up to the letter, but not the spirit of the contract. That she did bring out a collection of my short stories. They were in print for about 3 minutes, as far as I could see. I did write her a novel, but as God is my witness, I did not understand that because she was at a science fiction press, she was expecting a science fiction novel. And so when I handed her my novel, she said, "Well, I can't publish this."
Oh my gosh.
And there we were.
So how did you get your first novel published, and by whom?
Very slowly and painfully. I have always thought if I were a real writer, I would have taken that rejection and just written another novel. But instead, I thought, well, that was a waste of time. I won't be doing that again. And my agent, who was a great fan of the novel, tried very hard to publish it and failed. He eventually quit agenting, and I think my novel had something to do with that. He called me one day and he said that publishing had proved to be a cruel, cold world, and that he was going to go to law school where people would be nice to him again. And then I didn't have an agent and I didn't have a publisher, and that went on for about 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
23 rejections, but eventually I did land with the agent and editor that I had for most of my career. I am an old person now, so sadly both of those women are no longer with me, but they were there for most of my career.
Wow. And what was the name of the publisher that published your first book?
Henry Holt.
Okay. And you stayed with them for a while?
The editor was a very storied editor named Marion Wood, and she moved from Henry Holt, and she took all her writers with her. So then I ended up at Putnam, which is where I've been ever since.
Okay. And was your first novel, did your first novel end up going to Putnam?
No, my first novel was published by Henry Holt.
And it stayed with them, okay.
And it stayed with them, yes.
And was it just the one book, and then all the rest of them went with Putnam?
I can't remember if it was, I think it was maybe the third novel when we moved, but I don't honestly remember.
And you're still with Putnam?
I'm still with Putnam.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have you had, so you had one editor for quite a while. Obviously, you've got another one with them now.
Yes.
And do they take care of all of your ebook, or not ebook, but the audiobook narrators and your print book covers and all that?
Between my agent and my press, yes, they take care of all that.
Okay. And you've had your agent for quite a while.
Well, no. Again, the agent I had for quite a while also died a few years back. So I have, the new agent came on after We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves had sold, but before it was published. So Booth is actually the first novel that she has sold for me.
Oh, wow.
Although she took over with We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves.
Okay. So let's get right into to Booth. It looks like there was maybe 9 years between ourselves and Booth. Did you write anything else in those 9 years?
I wrote a couple of short stories. There's a writing workshop that takes place every summer, where all of my favorite people gather, and it's a critique workshop, a peer workshop with all published writers, and sort of the price of admission is that you have to have an unpublished story. So because I want to get together with my friends every summer that I go, I have to have written a story. I'm in that space right now. I've agreed to be there this summer. I don't yet have a story. It's just starting to weigh on me that I will. But mostly my answer to your question is no. I worked on Booth that entire time.
Wow.
Pretty much with a gap of a couple of years where I sank into despair over the election of Donald Trump. Could not write a word. I'm glad you think it's funny.
So did you have a fun week then with the indictment?
I was pretty excited. All
right, let's talk about Booth. First of all, I just want you to know that on Goodreads, it said that there were 1,385 people right now reading that book.
Oh my God!
I don't know where they come up with that, but they obviously didn't make it up. I mean, has it done well?
How do you know they didn't make it up?
It's Goodreads. Everybody trusts Goodreads. Amazon may be a different story, but has it done well?
I don't know. I don't go look because there's nothing I can do about it. So in many ways, it's just better if I don't know. I do have one data point, which is that when I have a book that's doing really well, my publisher sends me a bottle of wine at Christmas, and I did not get a bottle of wine, so I feel that's not a good sign.
This coming year.
This last year.
It'll be maybe two.
Maybe next year. Maybe it's a slow burn.
Okay, I do want to talk about Booth. I know it's historical fiction. Have you written any other novels? Are any of your other 7 novels historical fiction?
Yes, but of a different sort, I feel, in that I've written novels that take place in historical settings. So, my first novel took place in 1873. I have a novel that takes place in 1890. And actual events and actual historical figures wander in and out of those books, but they are not the central characters. It is a fictional story in a historical setting.
Understood.
This is the first book I have written in which I am focusing on actual historical figures and pretending I know what they were thinking and feeling at any given moment.
What made you take such a fairly dramatic turn in your writing to do this?
It was a circuitous route, and it started with me reading a couple of time travel novels that irritated me. And I was irritated because I felt the book suggested that it would be easy to pass, that, you change of clothes, quick crash course in the slang, and you'd be good to go. And I thought that, of course, it wouldn't be easy at all. I live in Santa Cruz. It's a tourist town. I think I can spot the tourists. I think that if I can spot somebody from Oklahoma, I could probably spot somebody from 200 years in the future pretty easily. But, I say that. It's possible Santa Cruz is filled with people 200 years in the future, and I'm just a fool. But this was my thinking. So I started thinking of time travelers as tourists, and I started thinking of how there might be destination vacations, that particular events that lots of people would want to go to, and you would put together a group. You would go through a tour, and one of those places, it seemed to me, might be the Lincoln Assassination. And so I wrote a story in which it is the day of Lincoln's assassination, and Washington, D.C. is just awash in time travelers. It's called Standing Room Only, most of whom are unable to actually get into the theater because there are so many of them. And so while I was doing the research for that story, I learned a lot about the conspiracy to kill Lincoln and and his Secretary of State and the Vice President, because they were all supposed to die that day. While doing that research, I happened on a contemporaneous story in the New York Times about the night Edwin Booth returned to the theater after the assassination for the first time. Edwin Booth being John Wilkes' older brother, and a very, very famous Shakespearean actor at the time. And it was just a very moving story, and I wrote another short story based on that night and that event. Somewhere in there, I happened on a story about the father of the Booth family holding a funeral for passenger pigeons and trying to talk a young reverend into officiating. He bought a gravesite at an actual cemetery. He wanted a service for the passenger pigeons, and the reverend was so startled that he went home and wrote an account of the evening he had spent with Junius Booth, discussing whether passenger pigeons had souls or not. So I wrote a third story based on that, and by then I was just so thoroughly hooked on the Booth family that I was constantly entertaining friends with stories about the remarkable Booths, and eventually they got tired and they said, just write a novel. We'll read the novel. Just put it in the novel.
Wow. You go back as far as, what, the early 1800s for this?
For the book?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 1830s probably. Okay. We sort of start in the 1830s.
And how long did it take you to do the research, and how did you do the research?
In general, I do about a year of research before I start to write, and in many ways, I'm looking for my story as I'm doing the research. When I start, I have a sense of maybe when and where, but little else. And so I'm doing a lot of reading, and I'm trying to find something that interests me enough that I will make it into a novel. So I did that about that year, and I had a really amazing event, a gift during that time that I was doing a lot of reading. I read a beautiful biography of John Wilkes Booth called Fortune's Fool by a writer named Terry Alford, and there was an incident in his book that I could not find anywhere else. And in a book that was meticulously footnoted, there was no source for this particular story. So I emailed him and I asked where he had come across this story, because I wanted to use it, but I wanted to know where it had come from and how reliable it seemed to be. And he emailed me back, and he said that sadly he could not remember where he had found this story. But he said, you're writing a novel about the Booths. I've been studying this family for 30 years. Perhaps you'd like to look at my papers. And so he just handed me 30 years of research that he had done on this family.
Are there any other historical fiction novels that go back as far as yours does? I mean, we all know there's lots of stuff about John Wilkes Booth, but to kind of explore the start of him and the family and all that, is that pretty unusual to have that kind of thing?
No, I think that's quite common.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We need to take a quick break.
Sure.
So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Karen Joy Fowler.
Thank you to the City of Montecirino for their continued support of KCAT Public Media. The City of Montecirino has enabled KCAT to inspire, educate, entertain, and inform our community through the magic of television and digital media for over 38 years. Thank you.
And welcome back to Lit with Lloyd and our guest, Karen Joy Fowler. Okay, so we've been talking about Booth, and that was published last year, wasn't it?
That's right.
Okay. Did it turn out, I really can't speak. Did it turn out the way you wanted it? Are you happy with how it came out?
I don't think that's a question I ask myself. I had a very different vision when I started. I felt I was thinking a lot about gun violence, as we are forced to do almost daily. And I was thinking about the families of the shooters and what they must go through. Obviously, an incredible tragedy to have someone you love killed in one of these episodes, but also tragic to love somebody who goes in with a gun. And because I had been thinking so much about the Booth family, it was very natural to start wondering what the impact of the assassination on his brothers and sisters, of whom he had quite a few, might have been. So the book, as I originally pictured it, the assassination would have taken place fairly early in the book, and then I would have spent most of the book looking at the effects on their lives. And instead, when I began to do the research, their earlier lives were just far too eventful and interesting to go so quickly to the assassination. So the book is instead an inverse of what I imagined it would be, which is that it's all the time leading up to the assassination and then a bit of the aftermath. But the bulk of the book takes place before the assassination. I don't regret changing my mind. I think their lives are more interesting before than they were after. So it's not the book that I pictured, but I feel very solid in that decision.
Yeah, good. Do you know anything about any of the descendants of that family modern day?
I know, and I should have looked it up so that I would have his name on my tongue, but I don't. I know that there is an actor, a television actor, who is a descendant from this family and who uses the last name Booth. And I think his name is maybe Edward, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah.
I know there are descendants, and I know the descendants sort of differentiate among themselves the people who have the Booth eyes and the people who don't, apparently. Particularly if Edwin and John Wilkes are examples, apparently their eyes were mesmerizing.
Okay, so with all the stuff you've written, have you ever gotten any interest from a movie or TV studio?
Well, there was a movie made of the Jane Austen book club.
Oh, wow. Based on your book?
Based on my book.
Oh, how cool is that?
And most of everything that I have written has been optioned, but that is not as exciting as it sounds.
No, I hear that.
Option can be $100. You get a letter from somebody who says that they are so passionate about your book, even though they have no money, they are hoping that you will allow them to have the option for a certain amount of time, and in return they promise you that their passion will carry them over the finish line, and then you never hear from them again. And that's been, and I am not complaining. That's $100 I did nothing for.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's like I found it in the gutter. It's quite nice.
But you do know that you are among a very small minority of authors who have gotten interest and actually had something made. We talk to authors all the time who had options but never got anything made.
It was very startling to me.
Wow.
I actually, as luck would have it, shortly after I signed the option, and I assumed that no movie would ever result. I thought, I honestly didn't give it another thought. And I was on a boat in the Antarctic where my daughter was working, and I was introduced to a movie producer on this boat. Somebody under the mistaken idea that we would have a lot to talk about and really like each other. And so he was told that I was a novelist. He was very unimpressed. And he said, well, have there been any movies? And I said, no. And he said, well, maybe someday. And I said, I don't even want a movie. What I want is the options. I want the options just to continue endlessly and never have a movie made, because that will be the end of the option money. And he just thought I was the most pretentious person he had ever spoken to. And I was equally unimpressed with him. And what I did not know was, at the very moment we were having that conversation, the script was being written for the Jane Austen Book Club. They had a date at which they had to tell me that they were making a movie, and they did not tell me prior to that date. And when I learned they had cast it, the script was done, it was ready to go.
Were you on the set at all?
I did. I did have one visit to the set. It was there's a restaurant scene in it, just two people eating and talking. I saw that scene over and over and over again. I thought, being an actor doesn't seem like as much fun as I thought it might be.
It kind of sounds a little bit like When Harry Met Sally, the restaurant scene, but maybe not.
Not with the same ending, no.
Okay, well, we'll get off Booth for now, but I need to go back and see if I can find the movie. How many years ago was it put out?
Quite a long time ago.
Really? Okay.
I'm going to say 10 years, but that's because I've reached an age where everything in my past seems to have happened 10 years ago. I bet it's more.
Is it the same title as the book?
It is.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. We're going to find it. Okay, so you've written a ton of novels, a whole bunch of short stories. You've put collections together. Where did the nonfiction come from, and what's it about?
I have written almost no nonfiction. I've written a handful of essays, usually around writing and advice for writers, or episodes from my writing life, but very little nonfiction.
And is that the way it's going to stay? I mean, you basically want to stick with fiction?
I think so, yeah.
Do you have your idea yet for your next novel?
I have an idea. It's too early to know if it's going to work or not, but I'm thinking about it a lot.
So after you do your short story for the summer program, will you start working on your novel?
Yes. Yes. I make that commitment to you.
And you heard it all right here, folks. When you do start a novel, do you dedicate a certain amount of time per day, a certain amount of months or years? I mean, how do you allocate your time for it?
In a very ineffective and indefensible kind of way. I was told very early in my career, long before I began to publish, the great writer Carolyn Forche said to all of us in a workshop she was teaching, you need to be in the same place at the same time every morning. She said, don't expect the muse to track you down at the grocery store. And I thought, well, that is excellent advice. Obviously, that is excellent advice. And I don't think that I have, in my entire 40-year career, put together more than 3 days where I managed to do that at a time.
Wow.
I write in fits and starts, and then I have long periods where I'm not writing because something really, really good is on television, and I am watching that instead.
Is your current publisher, have they already basically optioned for the next book? Or do you have to put it out there again?
They get the right of first refusal.
Okay.
But no, I've been very, very fortunate in my career, not to have to pre-sell a book before I've written it. And this is important because I have no idea how long it's going to take me.
Yeah, and you've never gotten pressure from them to put it out by a certain time.
No.
So the one book a year authors are always under a lot of pressure, and you don't have that kind of pressure.
They have my sympathy and admiration, but no, I could not do that.
And side note, there may be a little bit of fortune involved in that, but it seems to me that most of it is because of what you write and how you write and who you are, that you don't get the pressure to have to set a date. So congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
That seems
Thank
very
you.
well earned. Okay, so we know what's going to happen in the summer. We don't know yet what's going to happen for the next novel. But do you see doing this indefinitely? I mean, you obviously really enjoy it.
I enjoy parts of it, and there are parts of it I just find dreadful.
Like every job.
I expect, yeah. The first go is always quite dreadful, I think. I like once I have words on the screen and I'm looking at them and trying to improve them and moving them around, I really do like that part. And when I sort of understand the book well enough to know what the problems are going to be, and I can spend my time thinking about how I will solve those problems, I really enjoy that part, the sort of puzzle making of the book. But the initial, the initial ramp up, I really do not like at all. And I don't know, I've hit an age where I am asking myself, given that it is becoming incontrovertible that my days are not numberless, how do I want to spend? Do I want to spend the last bit of my life writing more novels? And I don't know. Some days yes, some days no. I had decided I don't, and then I saw what I would do instead. And what I would do instead is apparently play endless games of solitaire, to spend a lot of time fretting about the political situation and making sure that I am informed up to the minute of what has happened in Washington and the world. And, it's not the life I want. So maybe writing a novel is actually better, more fun, and certainly at the end of the day, as you're going to bed and you look back at the day you've just spent, it's more gratifying to think, well, I worked on my novel, than to think, well, I won most of my games of solitaire.
It does seem like you still need the distraction of writing a novel.
Yes.
So that you don't drive yourself crazy on the political front.
Absolutely.
Are you going to, you said you have an idea, but are you going to stick with historical fiction?
This would not be a historical novel. No, it's a comic novel.
Really?
Yep.
And will it be your first one that's of that type? No.
No, I feel I have been hysterically funny on multiple occasions.
Well, I'm only slightly embarrassed to say that the only one I've read so far is ours. But if there's something funny to read, I need to get back to it and try to find it. Okay, so we are basically at the end of our interview. We are going to take some questions from the audience if they have any. And first of all, audience, can we get a round of applause for Karen? That was really delightful. I really enjoyed that a lot.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. We are now going to take some questions from the audience. Who's got the first question? Yes, sir.
Yes. Karen, I think you mentioned in the interview that there are some descendants of the Booth family still with us, and I guess one of them is an actor. Do I remember that right?
Yes, that's right.
So my question is, do we know which of the Booth children, the the original family that you're writing about, which of those children has descendants? Is it Edwin Booth or John Wilkes Booth or who?
Definitely Edwin Booth. Definitely some of the cousins in the family. And after his death, many young women came forward claiming to have either been married to John Wilkes Booth or to have had his child. And mostly they wanted some sort of financial help from the Booth family. And so Edwin was very unimpressed with these claims and gave them very short shrift. But John Wilkes was apparently just catnip to ladies and an active young man. I find it impossible to believe that he didn't leave descendants, although they might not have been identified as such.
I guess they didn't have Ancestry.com back then, did they?
But they have it now. So, if I were really prepared for this question, I could have gone on Ancestry.com and I would know exactly what I'm talking about.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I have two questions about change over time. The first one is, from the start of your being published to today, what's the single greatest change in you as a writer? And the second one is, how has writing changed you as a person?
Oh, great questions.
Wow. Deep questions, difficult questions. I don't know if this is exactly responsive to your first question, but it is the first thing that occurs to me, that the greatest surprise I have had as a writer is to understand that it does not get easier and that it is not going to get easier. And that everything you think you learned to write your last book turns out to be only relevant to the last book and of no help at all in the book that you are currently trying to write. I think one thing that happens, or at least happened for me, is that there were some things that that came fairly naturally to me, some things that I do pretty well, pretty easily. And in my first books, I leaned a lot on those. But as I wished to become a better writer and to continue to be interested in the work that I was doing, in the later books, I have had to turn to things that do not come easily to me, to things that I have to think much more carefully about to try to make them to try to make them work as more central issues in my later books. So I guess the way I am answering that question is just to say that that in order to keep it interesting for me, I always need to have problems that I will have to solve that I don't know how to solve when I begin writing a book, and that where I locate those problems, what those problems might be, is something that has changed over time as I have tried to think about what my weaknesses are and work harder on those rather than leaning on my strengths. And I think, there are just so many ways that being a writer has changed my life. It's absolutely changed my identity and my sense of myself, because I do think of myself now as a storyteller in a way that I probably would not have when I was younger, although I was always telling stories, frequently in the form of preposterous lies that everybody in my family instantly saw through, but that I had always hoped they would not. I think, one of the very clear but maybe less profound changes is that I used to have a great deal of trouble speaking publicly, and now that is just not really an issue.
Correct.
I still, as we were saying earlier, I still do get very nervous right beforehand, but it disappears pretty quickly once I start talking. And I would never have imagined that I could stand up in front of large groups of people and natter away. But I also, I think I've gotten clearer on what I'm most interested in when I write, and that has to do both with who I am as a writer and who I am as a person. And I think in some very foundational way, the issue I am always grappling with is whether I think the world is more beautiful than terrible or more terrible than beautiful. And I am usually kind of right on a knife edge between those two things, that I am very conscious of the gifts and privileges that I have been given, that my life has been a very blessed one. But I am also very aware that other people have not had those lives. And so how to deal with the unfairness of the world, even though I feel in many ways I am a winner here, is something that I think about a lot, that I write about a lot, and that I don't know what to do about.
Yeah, good questions. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
This question isn't very well formulated in my mind.
Well, neither will the answer be.
Good. When you're writing, how much of your focus or your interest is on the particular story you're telling, as opposed to the craft of writing, how you're going to write it?
It's hard to separate those two out because in figuring out the story I'm going to tell, a lot of that involves making decisions about how I'm going to tell it, which are mostly kind of craft decisions. But I think that I already said that I really don't like the sort of first attempt I make, and that the pleasure I get comes later. And so the pleasure is mostly around the second of those, where I've got the story in my head. I'm trying to figure out the best way to tell it. But I'm also dealing with small craft issues of what language I'm going to use, and what the images might be like, and how rhythmic the paragraphs and sentences are going to be. That I think about those things a great deal, and they are pleasurable things to think about. But they are second draft, third draft, fourth draft kinds of issues.
It seems almost a little bit like the plotter versus pantser issue.
Yes, probably. I am certainly not a plotter. Although in the case of Booth, the plot, there it was.
Yeah.
Really.
Hand it to you.
Really can't spoil the ending for people.
Okay, all right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all very much, audience. We really appreciate that you were here.
Thank you.
And we are closing the book on today's podcast. I want to thank KCAT for sponsoring our show. And I really want to thank Karen Joy Fowler for just an absolutely wonderful interview. I really enjoyed it a whole bunch.
Well, thank you, Lloyd.
If you want to actually see the podcast on video or any of our other interviews, you can go on lloyd.show/YouTube, and there'll be a bunch of them for you to watch. So that does it from here, and we'll see you next time.
You just heard Lit with Lloyd here on KCAT Radio. Explore all our KCAT original programming at kcat.org/radio.